Okay, so you're probably wondering why I'm the person to talk to you about podcasting, other than I'm up front. But so I have a career in television and documentary filmmaking. I did that for 20 plus years. And about 5 years ago, I started working with the founder of Spartan Race and developing a podcast. And we started with zero about 5 years ago. 0 people in the audience for it, no concept, no guests, and we have over 16 million downloads now, and we have expanded to 6 days a week. So we have a show that's basically resilience for mind and body. We have interviews every Tuesday, and the other 5 days a week we have tips to help people kind of stay on track with their goals. We have nutrition, we have a psychologist who gives some kind of mindset tips, we have a strength coach, inspirational people, so a variety of people. So I've been deep in the podcast world for about 5 years, and I have also started a program this year called Interview Lessons, and kind of taken the work that I've done in documentary film and advertising, and now with podcasting, working with coaching people, directing interviews, conducting interviews, all of that. And so I also write articles, and I help people be better interviews. That is something that I be better at interviewing, I should say. So the presentation I'm going to give is pretty short. I'm psyched that it's a small audience, and I'll run through the slides, I'll give you an overview, and then we can ask questions and just chat. I'm much more comfortable with the chatting part. So what is a podcast, right? We start with that. So you may or may not have been hearing podcasts are getting a lot of attention right now. They're in the news. There's a lot of startups in that. You maybe heard about Sarah Koenig's show Serial. That was the big one that put us on the map. Basically, it used to be the digital world was blogs, which was written stuff, and a lot of people heard about that as a way to get their message out. Then we moved into visual, people started sharing photos, people started sharing videos. Audio is kind of the new frontier. Podcasting has been around for a while, but because people now have access on their mobile phones, it's very portable, it's very accessible, it's growing tremendously. So this is a little chart of monthly podcast listening. This is the first time ever that a majority of Americans have listened to a podcast, according to a study by Edison Research. They've been around for about 15 years, but the popularity has been gradually and steadily growing. In a 1-month period, Edison estimates that 90 million Americans, that is 1/3 of the population aged 12 and over, listen to a podcast at least once a month. So this is not anymore the kind of like geeky side thing. This is just becoming radio on your phone, basically. So the audience is growing. So who is listening? Pretty much everyone is listening. But right now we have this battle for attention in the world, right? And so I think it's something like 300 hours of video are uploaded to YouTube every minute. You can watch TV, you can listen to the radio, you're bombarded on Facebook and Instagram. But the interesting thing is that people listen to podcasts while they're doing other things. So it's another avenue to reach people. So if you have a message you want to get out, and you're finding that people are too busy to access that message, you may want to try the podcasting route, because people can listen while they're driving, as you can see, while they're doing housework, while they're driving, relaxing, cooking, baking, walking, running or exercising, riding public transportation. The other interesting thing, though, is that a lot of people are actually fully focused on the podcast. So that is a good piece of news, too. So the other reason you might want to consider podcasting is that right now people have so many choices, you may want to let them choose how they consume your content. So some people are going to be comfortable coming to a meeting like this. Some people are going to be comfortable watching something. Some people prefer to read. And there's going to be some people that are just comfortable listening. So even if you have written content, white papers or essays or explanations or plays, you may find that people are more likely to or more comfortable consuming that information by listening rather than reading. It might be that you repurpose the same content and put it on a podcast, or it may be that you create something unique for that. But it is another avenue to reach people. So where are people listening? They're listening everywhere while they're multitasking, right? The good news is that another good piece of data on podcasts is that 93% of people report listening to most or all of a podcast. In other words, they download the podcast, they listen to all of it. So people have a much greater attention span. One of the most popular podcasts out there is Joe Rogan. Sometimes they are an hour and a half, 2 hours. So this is kind of counter to the current thinking that in the digital world, your podcast or your video or whatever has to be 30 seconds to keep people's attention. The reality is, if the content's good, people will stay with it and listen. So if you're the kind of person that cares about these things, what does the audience look like? It's a little bit more educated than the average person. It's a little bit slightly skews male, and a little more likely to be full-time employed. So, some of this stuff this talk, to be honest, was put together more for people who had more of a commercial, people who represent a business or an association, a trade association. So some of this may be less relevant to you guys where you really just want to get your message out. But the idea is today, if you have a message you want to share, you really have to be holistic about it for two reasons. One is that reason we talked about, which is you have to allow people to consume the information the way they want to consume it. But the other is that, the way Google and the search engines work, the more you have multiple platforms all speaking to each other, the more likely it is for you to be found. And one of the cool things that's happening right now is just in the last couple of weeks, Apple came out with a new version of their podcast app. They're calling it Apple Podcasts. Google has upgraded things. So now, it used to be you had to go to a special app or an application and listen to a podcast there. But now, if you just search on Google, that will actually come up in the Google search with a little player, and people can actually play the podcast right in their browser, right from their Google search. And Google and Apple are also both starting to do back-end transcription, meaning that they're taking the words that you say, they're converting them to written words, and they're using that to make things searchable and findable. They're not publishing those transcripts, but it means that the things that you say, so if you talk about Rutland a lot in your podcast, you may come up in search results for Rutland. In other words, they're taking that sound and they're transcribing it to make it searchable. So it is, it's kind of the next frontier, and it's if you have a media presence, it's a good place to consider being. So here we get into the kind of like, how do you do it? Obviously, the 4 steps, especially those of you that have done something for PEGTV or commercial TV, you're already familiar a little bit with these, but obviously you plan. You're going to record it. It's an audio recording. Then you need to find a host, which is, that's the one thing that you'll have to pay for if you're creating a podcast. In other words, so I create my show, I upload the files, and I pay somebody, a company called Libsyn, and they send that show out to all the places where people can listen to it. So I'm going through all of this fast, and I'm hoping that we'll come back, and the things that are of interest to people or they have questions, we can come back to. But obviously, I think another misconception about podcasting might be that it has to be a talking head or has to be a VPR style show or an interview show. The reality is it's like television, it's like books. It can be almost anything. So you can do your show solo, it can be an interview show, it can be co-hosted. There are dramas, like plays, there are comedies, There are documentaries, there are experimental shows. And then the other thing is some people are intimidated thinking if I start a podcast, do I have to publish it every week? Not necessarily. There are some that are a finite series about a certain subject, and your subject might only require 10 shows and you're done. It could be a seasonal show. Maybe you are a baseball fan podcast and you are on during baseball season and then you're off. It can be timely, so it might be that if you have a conference that you're going to that you're excited about, or that your company hosts or your association hosts, that you would do a podcast just during that conference with like a daily wrap-up or something, a news update. Or it may be evergreen meaning that content is good forever. So maybe it's reviews of the great Shakespeare plays. That content is not going to change. Once you do those and record those and publish those will be out there forever, and you can continue to get new listeners over time. And there's a thing you guys may already be familiar with. This is kind of techie, but it's called the long tail. Has anybody heard of the long tail? Yes. Okay, we got good. So I'm not talking totally off the wall. So if you have a podcast and the first day you get 100 listeners, and you imagine a chart, and you have 100 listeners on day 1, day 2 you get 1 listener, day 3 you get 1 listener, day 4 you get 1 listener. After 100 days, that tail on the chart has 100 people. It's just as many people as you got in that first day. So sometimes that evergreen stuff, the shows that are interesting for the long term, even if they don't get a lot of listeners every day, you're still getting just as big an audience. It's what they call a long tail. So that audience is over 100 days. You're still getting 100 people if you get 1 a day for 100 days, or you get 100 in 1 day. So these are all different ways you can do your podcast. This is just an example. The Outdoor Industry Association, they did a special podcast and they shared it everywhere to speak to their members before they went to Washington, D.C. for a lobbying event. So it can be very timely, very specific, or it can be much broader. So gear, obviously we don't have to get super into the tech. I would prefer not to, but you don't need a lot. And if you're familiar with TV, it's basically going to be less than that. You need a microphone. You need a recording device. That recording device could be your laptop, it could be your iPhone or your Android device, it could be a digital recorder if you wanted to buy something. But it could be as simple as your earbuds and your phone, depending on the quality you want your show to be. You probably need to edit. That's probably the trickiest part. And then you'll need a hosting service, and that's the paid service. They're really reasonably priced. There are even some free ones. There's something called Anchor that actually lets you record the show and edit the show within the application, and they publish it right out to iTunes, and it doesn't cost anything. So they're trying to build an audience. Maybe eventually they'll charge, but there's a lot of options out there. So what happens is when you upload it to your hosting service, it creates an RSS feed, and that will feed to all of the services out there, including Alexa. Podcasts are now on Spotify, podcasts are on Pandora, podcasts are on radio.com, on iHeartRadio. If you've heard of any of these apps, pretty much anywhere you listen to audio. So where are people listening to podcasts? This is kind of interesting. There's still a little over 15% listening on their computer. Most are on the smartphones, that's obvious. Everybody's talking about Alexa and the speakers. That is 0.26% right now. So it's exciting and it's growing, but it's still not much of the pie. And then what apps? Basically, mobile aggregators are the kind of like any of the companies that have a podcast listening app. That's 15%. iTunes, which is now called Apple Podcasts, is still 60%, but Spotify is growing quickly at 10%. Okay, here's the reality check, though. The reality check is that according to Libsyn, which is the biggest hosting service out there, if you have 129 people listening to your show, you have more than 50% of the podcasts out there. So if you publish an episode and 129 people listen to it, you are doing better than 50% of the podcasts out there. I'll follow that up by saying you can have a very successful podcast without having big numbers. If you have an audience that you need to reach and you're reaching that audience, it doesn't matter how big it is. So if you are a hyper-local, if you are very niche, if you have a specific interest group and you're making that information available, you can be successful. You just may not have the numbers you think you should. And the reality is, like any of you who have been publishing content, if you have a website or a blog, you have probably already realized that if you write a blog post and you put it on your website, if that's all you do, it's not going to get anybody reading it. Same with podcasts. It's not the magic cure. If you aren't willing to work for an audience, if you aren't doing some other things to get people's attention, that podcast is not going to get a lot of listeners. There are 700,000 podcasts out there now, and it's growing quickly. So the good news is that's a lot fewer than there are blogs or websites. So in a way, you're still getting in on the ground floor, but there's a lot of them, and you do need to do things to get people's attention. So this is the stuff that you would have to do for any kind of program that you want people to find. You know, you have to share it everywhere. So that's kind of the official presentation. I'd love to hear if you guys have questions.
Yes. First one I have is, can the podcast include visual material?
That is it's a really good question, and the answer isn't simple. Apple Podcast app does actually allow for video podcasts. It's not an easy system to navigate. It's very difficult technically to do, and the audience is very small. But the newer version of the app, so the biggest place, as you saw, that people listen is the Apple Podcast app. That's just come out with a new version. And what I'm told is that new version will allow each episode to have, a photo associated with it. So when somebody is looking at the index of titles, they could also see a photograph. The other thing most people will do is they will do a web page or a blog post for each episode. And that's where the associated photos and text and whatever would be. But it's primarily audio content. And one of the reasons you want to make sure that it makes sense in that context is that most people are going to listen while they're driving or walking or running, and so they're not going to see the visual element. So if they require the visual element to understand it, it might not be a perfect podcast.
I'm curious about those numbers that you have, the 129?
Yes.
Is that lifetime or is
Per
that
episode.
day one?
Per episode.
For over how long the time period is?
So the standard, that's another good question. The industry standard for podcasts is to measure 4 weeks out. And that basically, most shows will get a big chunk of downloads in the first day, a few, a significant chunk the next day, and then after that, it trails out. The idea is Apple, kind of like Google, is notoriously mysterious about how they rank people. Apple is the same. There's a lot of information they don't give out, including number of subscribers. And so this is kind of a standard way that the industry is using for now to estimate how many people are actually following the show.
Yeah.
My question is somewhat related to his. I'll give you an example of that Krista Tippich.
On Being.
Yeah, on Being. So her website obviously has videos and visuals and text on
Yeah.
it, but it does allow you to download the episodes.
Yeah.
And so I've done that before, and basically, I guess there's a couple part question is, one is, she's doing this on her own website. Obviously, she has a staff, so she's not necessarily using one of these other outside services. So it's just done on a regular website. But it looked like it was, you have to download the whole episode as opposed to streaming it.
Yeah. Yeah. So podcasts technically are a downloaded medium. Now, when I use the term podcast, I'm using it broadly in what I think is a practical way, which is audio content on the web, right? Sound that's digital. There are some people who say it's only a podcast if it's available in the Apple Podcast app or, so, but I would guess that Krista Tippett most likely uses a service like this, like Libsyn or one of the other hosting services, uploads that file there. That file is then sent out by that service to Spotify, to iTunes, to all those places, and there's an embeddable, like a little player for that she can put in her website. And the reason she's probably doing that is that she wants to count how many people have listened, and if she has, it all traces back to that original file on the hosting service, and she can keep track of how many people listen.
She was doing it two ways. I think she was streaming it, or
Right.
downloading
And
it,
so-
playing it right there, or just downloading for later use.
Right, and so when you listen in the Apple Podcast app, even if you're streaming it, it's downloading it. It's
It's just more in real time.
Yeah.
So if you have a podcast, and will it respond to on demand? In other words, can you access it?
anytime. So like the show that I produce, we have new episodes coming out 6 days a week. But those episodes, anyone could go back 2 years later and find any of those. Now, the way most of the apps work is they'll put the most recent at the top. So if you have 360 episodes like I do, it's going to be hard to find the old stuff. But if you put it on your website in a searchable way or you link to it, those links are always active, so you can find it.
How is the podcast then any different from an active website?
So the reason a podcast is different from an active website is that many people, as you saw, 64% are listening in, for example, the podcast app. So it's people's consumption habits. So if you are used to listening to a podcast that way, that's where it's kind of like saying, I have a photograph, I put it on my website. How is that photograph different than a photograph on Facebook? It's not. It's still a photograph, but different people are seeing it because they're already on Facebook. So a podcast is only different from audio that you put on your website because it's someplace else. But
Probably maybe the size also, the independence of it.
it doesn't have to be any unique size. It can be any size, any length. What makes it a podcast is just that it is available on all these different audio applications. So basically it's like Netflix, right? Or, so if you watch a movie on Netflix, it's like listening to radio on iTunes or whatever app you choose to listen to it on.
So the content is really what differentiates it from typical PEGTV show.
Well, so content meaning like what you're talking about could be anything. Just like a book could be anything, right? The content can be anything. What makes it a podcast is it is a sound file. So it's just audio, it's just audio. It doesn't have video, there are exceptions, but basically it's just a sound file. And it is published through these various means that most people today have in their pockets, and they can listen to it wherever they want. I hope that makes sense.
Let me ask this related question, I guess. On Comcast TV, there's a section called Music Choice.
Yeah.
And you can select like 6 to 10 choices of types of music.
Yeah.
That's on your television screen.
Yeah.
Is that really podcast type material? Could it
So-
become that?
Usually a podcast, like strictly music is usually not considered a podcast. It's usually got some kind of talking in it. But there are places, once you publish through these services, some of them can, you can listen to some podcasts through some of the cable services like that. So it could be. Somebody else had a hand up. Yeah.
Hi, Marion. Hi. I had a couple questions. You mentioned the Joe Rogan podcast, and it's funny because I listen to it often, and last night I just happened to be watching it with, I don't know if you know, but Joe Rogan podcast is on YouTube. So I watch it, and his guests are really intriguing, and then I fall asleep, and I'm still listening. So I think it's advantageous that way, to watch it and then be able to fall asleep while still listening to it. And I also think it might be popular because his guests are so engaging. He's got all these guests from all different genres and ages and whatnot. So my question to you is, if you were just starting out, what are the pros and cons of just publishing to YouTube?
So if you're starting out and you're just publishing to YouTube, that can be a great thing to do. It's not a podcast. Technically, it's a YouTube channel. So that's a great opportunity, and that might be useful to you. Again, if it's a audio, Joe Rogan gets a lot of his audience in the audio version, right? It's people listen to it in their car, people listen to it, while they're working out, people listen to it as audio content. And so the big advantage of the audio content is, again, this multitasking thing. It's that if you are, if you're in the marketing business or the content business, or you're in the business of getting, customers or conveying a message or getting information out, that the hardest thing to do is get people to pay attention to you. You can't buy attention. You need people to listen. And if you can access people through another avenue, people say, I don't have time to watch certain things on a show, right? Because maybe I happen to live in the middle of nowhere and have an hour drive to pick my kids up from after school sports. That's time I can't be watching a YouTube video. I can't be reading a blog. I can't be watching cable TV, but I can be listening to a podcast. So all of a sudden, there's just another route to access your audience that's available.
So does he publish to YouTube, but then has that service and publishes his audio?
His primary audience is as an audio only, as a podcast. He's also on YouTube.
Oh, so he's got somebody else creating the video content to add to the
He does it at the same time. So he literally, so if you've watched the show, right, there's two cameras and two microphones, and the cameras are recording video, and the same sound that goes to YouTube is isolated. It's just recorded as a soundtrack and pulled out, and that's the podcast. The ads are a little different. Exactly.
Okay.
It's audio only is the podcast. Okay. Yes.
Kind of a couple questions. So the first part would be, you mentioned Libsyn and the using a service to distribute your material, but is that necessary if you just want to, is it possible to just put it on the Apple Podcast app without paying an outside thing, or you have to?
So you have to host it somewhere.
The Apple Podcast app basically, and all what we call the mobile aggregator apps, what they do is they read the file. They don't physically host it. If you have Google or Apple or something on your phone and you have to pay for storage space in the cloud, the host is literally storing the file for you and making it accessible to all those people. So there are free services. Anchor is one, and they will host it and they will send it to iTunes for you.
So regardless, you'll need the host.
If you want to be a podcast, you do need a hosting service. But like I said, Anchor is one that is a self-contained. They distribute it within their network, but they will also send it to the other platforms. I can't tell you, Libsyn is sort of the grandfather, most established host, but there are many other services, and I use that one, so I know it best. But I do know that Anchor is a free one.
Okay, and just a second question. I As far as monetization goes of this, I know that with YouTube, like, you can put ads on, but of course you need to reach a certain threshold on YouTube before you're even eligible for that. So is podcast similar, where you can put ads on your podcast and that's where the monetization comes in, or like have a sponsored podcast or something like, does that?
That's actually a great question because it is different. There's where, like, I might be getting a little too detailed here, but so if you watch a YouTube video and you see ads in it, you know, there's like the little yellow block when the ad comes in, and sometimes you could watch the same show twice and have a different ad in the same place. So they're not what we call baked in. They're in there. It's called ad insertion technology, and so the ad will, YouTube will basically sell the ads, and they get put into the shows that it thinks are appropriate. Podcasting right now, most of the hosting services do not, and in the past, none of them had ad insertion technology. So basically, if you have an ad in your podcast, you are recording that when you record the show. It won't be swapped in and out.
Right.
It's there forever, and they're not going to sell it for you, for the most part. There are exceptions to this. So in a way, that's good news. For somebody like you who's starting local and getting started, you're probably, so if you're selling like an ad insertion technology, something like YouTube does, or there are podcast hosting companies that will do that if you reach, again, a certain threshold of listeners. But all of those are going to be sold strictly at a CPM model, meaning your price that you get for the ad is strictly based on how many people download. And we saw how challenging an audience can be. But if you have a niche audience and you have people that a certain company really wants to reach, you know, maybe you speak to owners of a particular style of short-haired poodle, right, a certain breed, and you have a really loyal audience. It's only 200 people, but they love that dog. There may be a company that sells that product that might want to partner with you and be willing to pay you. They're not going to pay, if you are selling through the technology, you're going to be selling strictly on a number of downloads. And with 200 downloads, you know, it's pennies on the dollar. It's not going to be worth it for you or for them, right? But if you have a niche audience and there are products that want to partner with you because they're aligned in their message and they want to reach your particular specific audience, they might be willing to pay much more than that. And they might be able to pay specifically for being a part of your show, right? So there are new companies, they're pitching me and my show right now. They want us to move our hosting to a company that does ad insertion, and we're looking at it. But most of those will not work with you until you reach a certain level of audience.
Is that pretty much the only way of monetizing, like ads and like sponsorships?
So there's actually a lot of ways to monetize. A lot of people have a podcast as a means to sell a product. So if you, if you sell if you have a webinar, an educational product, if you have a retreat or a book, if you have a product that you sell, a podcast can be a great way to sell that. So you're using your show to establish yourself as an expert and to get people familiar and to bring them into your environment where they may want to purchase your product. So that's another way that people monetize the podcast. But basically, I mean, that's it. You either advertise for them or for yourself, you know, for somebody.
How is a podcast different from a webinar?
So a webinar is also an online product. It is usually live and interactive. It's kind of like a digital version of this would be a webinar. So I would say 6 o'clock, log into this particular room and come and ask me questions. And I'll give a little presentation, and digitally you can type in questions and chat. You may even be able to speak. It's more of an interactive thing. A podcast is really, the best way to think about a podcast is like a radio show.
But it doesn't allow activity from
Back and
you,
forth, no, it doesn't. It's a
the
one.
listener.
Again, yeah, it's like a radio, it's very much like a radio show that's on the computer. That's the simplest way to think about it. Yeah.
The example that you two discussed a second ago about the poodle,
Yeah,
that was the example that I read, or what I read what the short tail was, which was that you have this vast audience out there, and maybe the topic that you're talking about doesn't, you know from the start it doesn't have a big audience, so in the past you never would have done anything, but now you have the ability, because you don't have to have a audience, it's all in one metropolitan area or a mass audience. You can just put it out there, and you get people from all over the world or all over the country, and they would add up to enough of an audience for you.
Same concept, different graph. This time, the graph this way is over time, and in that way it's over interest or region or whatever. Yeah.
Originally, I guess, was sort of like in the statistics class, we had the normal distribution. It's the two tails that are at the far end.
yeah,
They're kind of like out of the normal.
yeah.
But the other thing I was going to mention that, it's funny, like there's the general specific definition of podcasting, they're real general. And I have Sirius XM in my car, which I don't use that much because I'm working mostly from home. So I listen to it through my cell phone most of the time. And so that's a streaming, satellite streaming service.
Yeah.
But when it's on your phone, it's audio that's streaming. And then, so you can listen to programs that normally have, let's say, like, C-SPAN or any of the cable news shows, you can listen to the audio only. And so that's kind of like that. The other thing is you can watch clips from these different programs through YouTube, but if it's like Jim Rogan or any of these other shows, if it's mainly just a conversation or an interview, you don't even have to necessarily, you could be doing other things and not listen to the YouTube.
So some of the podcasting hosting services will actually let you publish your podcast to YouTube. There's no video, it's just like a graphic with your logo. So some people just like people listen to music on YouTube now, some people just listen to a podcast there.
I guess what I was trying to say is you have to keep your phone, if it's YouTube, you have to keep the screen on, or otherwise if it goes out or if you switch to a different app, it'll shut the sound and shut it down for a second. But if you just let it run, I just plug it in, so you're probably wasting some electricity. But I can just get by with listening to the audio.
If you're going to do a travel podcast, you'd probably have to have everything set up before you left. Maybe it'd be easier just to record on site and then do it when you get back, because what difference would it make to an audience whether it was live from the site or
and if
2 weeks?
you probably don't want to spend your vacation editing your podcast, right? So you could, so here's a great example though. You could do a podcast if you had, 20 students in your class and they were really interested in your trip. You could do a podcast while you're on your trip that those 20 students wanted to listen to every day during the trip. And that's an example. That could be a success even though only 20 people are listening to it. It doesn't always have to be, it depends on who you're talking to, right? And so if you felt like if you had something that was timely, like, well, this message only works while I'm on the trip and it's directed for these 20 people that are kind of waiting back in the classroom to hear it, that would be one way to do it. But in your case, it sounds like you're probably best off to make a plan, make sure you have a decent microphone and a means to record. And it could be your phone. I would probably buy a microphone that works with your phone that's a little better quality so you have something good, and then come back and edit it. If you have time before you go, I'd practice a little bit, and understand. I would practice editing an episode to understand what that's going to entail before you get yourself into it. Because I do know a lot of people that go out and record a lot of stuff and then find it's too much work to put it all together.
Could I do a little brief show of hands? How many deal with a nonprofit organization or doing nonprofit work? How many are familiar with a place called archive.org, called the Internet Archive? Pretty well secret. It is an attempt to freely record and save everything that would appear on the Internet forever. The interesting thing is if you have your own website, they will accept your uploads. And our website is basically almost everything is uploaded to archive.org because it's totally free. They're happy to record what we're doing. And so the website really is a link back from them. And one of the results is that your videos play impressively because the videos actually not from your website. You have no crashes because they're running off a huge face machine. And so you just click and they play seamlessly. And it's all free. It's just your effort to be able to upload. It includes text, includes music, includes video. You name it, it's on the internet. Would you be able to take a podcast and upload it to Internet Archive where it could be downloaded on demand at any time, anywhere?
It's a great question, and I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the answer to that. I guess you'll have to find out.
Because it sounds like an intriguing piece of the internet that they're trying to secure.
Sorry, you had a question up front,
Yeah,
didn't you?
I know what that means.
Yeah.
I have a couple questions, actually, a few. So I'm thinking about copyright protection, because obviously you don't want somebody snatching your ideas, and also about liability. Say you're doing a meditative podcast and somebody drives off the road because they're falling asleep at the wheel. So liability and copyright. And then my other question is, procedurally, is there some kind of tutorial that would help you get started and talk you through the process? So I guess I have a lot of questions, I'm sorry.
I'm going to go in reverse order.
Perfect.
So procedurally, in terms of that, yes, there is. There are many of them. There are a lot of fly-by-night ones too that are not fly-by-night, but there's a lot of like people that will charge you a lot of money to find out things that you can find out for free. So I do know that the hosting service I use, again, they don't pay me. It's the service I use, so I know them.
Yep.
They do a free webinar about once a month or every few weeks that teaches you kind of the basic steps, how to get started. Libsyn, Libsyn, yep. And yes, it's short for Liberated Syndication. It was, yeah. So they do, but there are many others, and there's a lot of services out there. They do the step-by-step.
Okay.
The second question, I'm now jumping back to the first question, which was copyright.
Yeah.
So I am not a legal expert. I will tell you that, your goal is to get people to listen to your stuff.
Yeah.
So you want it wherever it can be. This is something that comes up. The way that these shows are distributed is an RSS feed. What that means is your hosting service puts out basically a feed that these other apps can pick up. And these other apps pick it up and people listen to it on their phone. Mm-hmm. So you don't generally get to control, depending on the service you use, but once that feed is out there, places are going to pick it up. I have seen some places syndicate our content on their website, but that will happen if you have a blog, that will happen if you have a YouTube channel. If you want to make a big stink about it, you probably can. We haven't found it's really a big issue yet. I assume whatever copyright protections would go for a radio show or a book are the same. I don't know that. We certainly publish a copyright notice. I know that applies to our video products. I don't know anything about the liability. Those are not areas of my expertise. Yeah. I think somebody who hadn't asked something yet maybe had a question. Was that, yeah?
The question I had was about copyright. I know with PEGTV, if we put videos out there and they have certain musical content.
yeah.
That's why I was wondering if you create a podcast and who monitors what is on there, like ASCAP and certain music organizations.
So that part, I thought you were asking, is your material protected?
Well,
and I don't know the answer to that. But the other way,
idea or vice versa.
so first of all, the ideas are very difficult to protect. I mean, that's a whole nother thing, but like everybody's got an idea, and the chances are you have an idea, you're probably not
Somebody
the
else
only
also
one,
does.
right? But your words are protected. You know, that is standard copyright. But again, don't quote me on that. I'm not a legal expert, but I can tell you, just like anywhere else, you can't use music that you don't own. You can't steal other people's words. You can't, you know, I mean, anything that would apply, basically, if you're making a YouTube video or PEGTV or any place else, pretty much applies.
Well, if you had let's say you were taking things out of context of someone's speech to bring your point about.
Same as with TV. I can't tell you the details. I'm not a legal expert, but just like if you're doing something with PEGTV, I know that there are certain allowances in certain contexts, and I would guess that would be the same in a podcast.
Does the hosting service come back and say this is not allowed?
So the hosting service probably would not, but I do know that there are people who have had major legal battles when ASCAP or the music company finds that they've been using their music and sues them, and it's a significant problem. So the same rules apply. The rules apply. And the other thing that's just a kind of an interesting quirk is bad language, that kind of thing. If you probably want to make sure that you have no bad language in your podcast. Joe Rogan certainly uses it. So if you do have bad language, you click a little box to say it's explicit. But what that means is it won't be available in certain countries at all. It won't be available to certain age groups. So if you want the biggest audience, but obviously if you're talking about an adult issue or you have an adult comedy show or something like that, you're going to mark it explicit, you'll be fine. But that does get checked, it does get flagged. If you have bad language in your show and you have said that it's a clean show, you will, you'll be penalized in the sense that you won't get the audience you want. Have we exhausted the podcasting topic? No, we have another question.
Well, I guess it's somewhat related to this question. Isn't there a thing called fair use? So if it's like, if you're doing it for an education purpose, like teaching a class or the podcast is educational, you could refer to a quote or a clip or...
Yeah. So again, I'm not a legal expert. The rules that apply for TV, and Peg probably has some experts in that, apply to the podcast. So yes, there is such a thing as fair use. I know there are limitations on how long and on what context, and I don't know the answer to that.
So if someone makes a public statement on a news show and you're talking about it on your podcast and you say, X person said this, this, and this, they're probably not going to sue you for that. If you use the sound from the news clip, you're probably going to get sued because that's theirs. But you can't use their video and sound footage, but you can restate what the guest said. I was watching on C-SPAN and such said this, and then you can say their statement, right? Okay, but if if you want to use their actual sound of them saying it, you're probably going to run into issues. But to restate what someone said publicly, I don't think that's right. You see what I'm saying? So you gotta, yeah.
Yeah, there's actually a really popular genre of podcasts, which is fan podcasts. Like there are whole podcasts, many, about popular TV shows, and they're just talking about what happened on the TV show.
Such and such said this at this time, and then they restate it, and you might say their quote, but it's different than playing the sound that you recorded off your TV and then put it on your podcast. That's going to be a copyright strike probably, unless the people give you permission to.
I think the fair use does definitely come into play to a certain extent, because on YouTube there's certain channels that are literally drama channels, and so they'll literally include the footage and the audio from another channel, but they have a role that plays at the beginning of each thing that has literally word for word the fair use for criticisms, etc., so that they don't get copyright strike, but they'll literally use footage from other channels and then be talking about it and criticizing it, and their channel's monetized. They're not, so they're, to a certain extent, the fair use comes into play.
There are resources out there, and I mean the answers are clear. I just don't know them.
Anytime you come into using other people's stuff, you're just gonna probably get into trouble unless you have explicit permission from them, you know? I think that's the safest rule. We always seem to be talking about copyright at these meetings.
Another big difference is whether you're using it to talk about it or using it to create.
Right, that's it, that's the point I was trying to make, Daniel,
So,
yeah.
yeah, if you were to use the soundtrack just as a background for your podcast, that would be a big no-no. But if you were to play part of the soundtrack and then comment on it.
But I can say certainly and again, there are very specific limitations. Like there are music review shows that have been pulled. So even though they're, exactly. So I'm just saying that there are rules, they are specific, and there are plenty of resources. That'd probably be a good workshop to give.
Still confusing when you look into it. There are rules, but it's still confusing. Any other questions?
Would it make sense to do a down and dirty podcast, you know, just to show us?
I don't have any of the equipment here. I mean, really, so it's an audio recording, you know, and I'm not really. There might be a hands-on workshop that somebody could do in the future, but that's kind of, I'm not able to do that right now.
Can you talk about the equipment you would need to get started and recommend a brand that's better than the other, or?
I can talk in some broad terms a little bit. I mean, there's, as you guys have seen with the cameras here, there's a lot of stuff out there, and there's a lot of ways to do this, right? So I can tell you, generally speaking, for microphones, and if you've worked with PEGTV, a lot of the stuff is consistent to that. You know, there's this kind of like a lapel mic. Most people will use a mic on a stand. There are microphones that will plug right into your iPhone. And you can record, again, on your iPhone, on your computer. Something has to record it. You can buy a digital recorder to do that. I'm not really a technical resource.
If you're doing like an interview talk podcast versus a music, well, you probably want to do it.
Yeah, I mean, most podcasts are not music. Generally, if you're producing music, you're going to publish it in a different way, probably. But yeah, I believe music would require different microphones than speaking.
Years ago, with sound systems, you probably heard like the Shure SM57, 58. Those were like the workhorses, $50, like you were saying, for people would accidentally drop them or take them.
Again, you know, if you want to get started, if you have a microphone, use that. If you listen to it, it's not good enough quality for you, then start doing some research into what's better. If you want to just get started, try recording it on your phone. Right in your phone, play it back. If you feel like that doesn't sound good enough for you, then you're going to start researching. Try your earbuds. If that doesn't sound good enough for you, move up to the next level. It's all about the level of production value you want. You can spend thousands, on getting a studio, getting the right mic, all that. And, certainly to somebody who's expert in that, they may know the difference. You're going to find the point for you, the balance between cost and quality. But I would start at the bottom and listen, because don't overspend. Start with what you've got, and then if that's not good enough, then you can start looking for something better.
Yes. I realize that you're interviewing listeners as part of your business, but could you just give us one or two tips if you, some large brushes?
I can give you some large strokes. Basically, there's 5 kinds of interviews. There's the testimonial. There's the journalistic, there's the conversational, there's the curiosity-driven, and there's the story-driven. And what that means is when you're planning to do your interviewing, so say somebody like Howard Stern, probably most of you guys are old enough, you know about Howard Stern. That's what I call the conversational interview. And what I mean by that is in a conversational interview, your audience is just as interested in what you as the host have to say and your opinion as you are in the guest's opinion, right? So that's what I call the conversational style of interview. There's what I call the curiosity style of interview, curiosity driven. So that's somebody, if you listen to somebody like Terry Gross, or you listen to Errol Morris, the documentary filmmaker, they go into an interview and start asking questions, but they don't know where it's going to end. Larry King talks about this. He doesn't prepare. I mean, some of these people prepare a ton. Terry Gross prepares a ton, but Larry King, minimal preparation. He doesn't know where the conversation's going to go. He just starts asking questions, listening, engaging, and following those turns, right? The journalistic style of interview, you don't know the answers ahead of time, but you know exactly what you need to find out. So you might want to know, what happened, when, where, what the budget was, who was in the room. You have specific questions. And in that, your goal is really to keep the person accountable. You may have to ask the question again and again, keep them on track. That's the journalistic style. Testimonial, that's when you have a customer or a client, somebody who uses your service or your product, and you want them to talk about your product. And there's ways you can get them to do that better. And what's the fifth one that I haven't talked about yet? Story-driven. So story-driven is something happened to somebody did something, and you want them to talk about it. So you're going to ask a lot of questions that help build that framework. You're going to ask what happened next. What did you say then? You're going to ask questions to bring them back to that moment. You're going to ask them about what did it smell like? What did it look like? What did it feel like? What did it sound like? Those are things that will bring the person in their mind back to the moment. So for me, most of you will do, if you do an interview show, it's going to be some combination of those 5. But knowing what each one is and thinking about that, thinking about how you address and how you interact with your subject is going to help. That's the first step. The second one is prep. There's a little bit different ways to prep for all of them, but one of the key things that a lot of people forget about when they're prepping for an interview is the part that happens right when you sit down with the person. So there's all the research you do, but when you're going to interview someone, when you sit down next to them, they want to be successful. They want to be a good guest. They're on your show because they want to reach your audience or convey their message. So the more you can let them do that by explaining what you're looking for, and sometimes that's really specific, like, well, our audience is going to expect short, concise answers. It's very conversational. Or tell them, I'm going to ask you a question and you just run with it. Long answers. You may tell them how to hold the mic. You may tell them, our audience is very interested in books. So if I ask you, a general question and you reference what book you've been reading, they're going to engage with it more. The more you can help them be a good guest, the better. That's the part of prep I think a lot of people overlook. And then the last kind of like secret to interviewing is the silence, the uncomfortable silence. And that's the greatest technique is when you're talking to somebody and you ask a question or you're having a conversation and the conversation reaches a pause. And there's that uncomfortable silence. And any person who's courteous or polite is looking to jump in and get the conversation moving. If you can bite your tongue and you can wait longer than they wait, you will often get the best pieces of interview that of the whole conversation. There's lots more, but those are 3 little tips I would give you. So I think we're good, right? Yes. So if you want to know more about the interviewing stuff, interviewlessons.com, and I have articles and stuff, and I'm starting to build that. And that's really what I like to speak on and consult on.
Back to do that presentation. Thanks for coming.